Before we begin, tell me what time it is where you are right now, and which country you're watching from, because by the time this video ends, you'll remember exactly where you were when you heard these stories. These aren't ghost tales or urban legends. Every woman you're about to meet is real, and every name comes from inside a UK prison cell where daylight barely reaches. From nurses who turned healing into horror, to lovers who murdered for obsession, these are Britain's most infamous female killers. Stay with me until the end, because the final case, the last woman on this list, is almost impossible to believe. Press play, turn the lights down, and don't look away. 1. Lucy Letby. The corridors of the Countess of Chester Hospital were meant to echo with the soft rhythm of heart monitors and newborn cries. But behind the pastel walls and tiny cribs, something invisible was happening, something no one could explain. Babies who'd been thriving suddenly stopped breathing. Alarms screamed in the night. Parents were called to say goodbye before they ever truly said hello. And walking quietly through it all was Lucy Letby, the smiling nurse everyone trusted. To her colleagues, Lucy was the gentle one, the one who remembered birthdays, who brought cupcakes to night shift, who spoke softly to infants as she adjusted their oxygen lines. No one imagined that same steady hand could be the one silencing their fragile breaths. But between 2015 and 2016, in the neonatal unit of a small English hospital, that trust began to rot from the inside out. At first, there was no pattern anyone could see. A baby boy who collapsed without warning. A set of premature twins. One died, the other barely survived. A girl who went blue in her mother's arms moments after feeding. Each tragedy was explained away as bad luck, a cruel coincidence of medicine and fate. But coincidences kept multiplying, and somehow Lucy Letby was always there. She wasn't the doctor making final calls. She wasn't the administrator writing reports. She was simply the nurse assigned to care for them, present when hearts stopped, when oxygen dropped, when grief entered the room. It was only when one consultant noticed how often her name appeared on the duty roster during each collapse that suspicion began to whisper through the ward. The truth, when it finally came out, was almost too horrifying to process. Lucy Letby wasn't killing for money or revenge. She wasn't driven by hatred or impulse. Her weapon wasn't a gun or a knife or poison. It was the trust of an entire hospital. Investigators later discovered her methods were disturbingly subtle. Tiny air bubbles injected into bloodstreams. Invisible, deadly, impossible to trace at first. Feeding tubes tampered with just enough to cause catastrophic injury. In some cases, doses of insulin slipped into IV bags meant for nutrients. Each act delivered with the same calm precision she used to wrap a blanket or check a pulse. Babies who had been improving, babies who had beaten the odds, suddenly spiraled into cardiac arrest. What makes her crime so chilling isn't only what she did, but where she did it. The neonatal unit was supposed to be a sanctuary, the one place parents could finally exhale after days of fear. Lucy turned it into a hunting ground. She moved among incubators like a caretaker, smiling, documenting every shift, while privately keeping a collection of mementos, sympathy cards she had written to grieving parents, handwritten notes, and a message scrawled in her own handwriting later found by police. "I am evil. I did this." That note became the line that haunted the courtroom. It was found inside her tidy Chester home, tucked among the reminders of an ordinary life. Scented candles, pastel notepads, children's cartoons saved on her laptop. Investigators found no grand motive, no manifesto. Just a woman who, by every surface measure, appeared gentle and unremarkable. But beneath that quiet exterior, something monstrous had been building. A need to play God over the most fragile lives imaginable. The middle of the trial became a national obsession. The public wanted answers. Why? How could a nurse sworn to protect become the agent of death for the very patients who could barely breathe without help? Prosecutors described her actions as a complete betrayal of everything nursing stands for. Over and over, they played the heart-stopping moment parents recounted seeing her by their child's bedside seconds before collapse. Some said she offered comfort. Some said she simply watched. When the verdicts came down in 2023, the silence in court was heavy enough to crush air. Lucy Letby was found guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to kill several others. Crimes committed over 12 unthinkable months. The judge's words were unflinching. She would never be released. A whole life order. The harshest punishment British law allows. No possibility of parole, no second chance. Today, Lucy Letby lives behind reinforced doors, under constant surveillance, separated from the other inmates for her own protection. She has become a name whispered in hospitals as a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask or carry a weapon. Sometimes it wears scrubs, smiles softly, and whispers lullabies. For the families she destroyed, justice brought no comfort. Their babies' names remain etched into hospital plaques and quiet memorials, each representing a life cut short by the person they trusted most. And somewhere deep inside a maximum security cell, the woman once called the kind nurse sits in silence, surrounded by walls she can never leave. Walls that will forever echo with the cries she silenced. 2 Rose West. There's an ordinary-looking house that once stood on a quiet street in Gloucester. Brown brick, small garden, curtains that never quite closed. From the pavement, it looked like every other home in the neighborhood, until police began digging beneath it. What they uncovered would change how Britain saw the word home forever. Behind those walls, Rose West played the perfect wife. She laughed easily. She waved to neighbors. She told stories about her growing family and the young girls she sometimes took in to help around the house. But when detectives began peeling back the layers of that facade, they found the walls themselves were hiding the screams. Long before the world knew her name, Rose was already living in the orbit of a man named Fred West, a builder with a grin that could turn cold in an instant. Together, they created something more dangerous than either could have managed alone. Fred brought the cruelty. Rose brought the control. And their home at 25 Cromwell Street became the stage for one of the darkest partnerships in British history. From the outside, nothing gave them away. Fred built extensions, Rose ran a small lodging business, and children played in the front yard. But the guests who crossed their threshold didn't always leave. Inside those narrow rooms, Rose and Fred turned everyday life into a nightmare of control, domination, and death. It began in the early 1970s. The missing girls, the runaways who vanished without trace. Young women lured by kindness, by promises of work or shelter. Some were hitchhikers, picked up along the motorway. Others were acquaintances who trusted Rose's motherly smile, but once the door closed behind them, their fates were sealed. The crimes weren't just about killing. They were about power, the kind of power that fed on terror. Victims were held captive in the cellar, restrained, humiliated, and tortured in ways too sadistic to speak aloud. Rose's role wasn't passive. She wasn't a bystander swept up in her husband's madness. She directed it, participated in it, even took pleasure in the suffering they inflicted. And while she and Fred carried out their private horrors below ground, life continued above, as if nothing were wrong. Children were born. Meals were cooked. Music played. Visitors came and went. The normalcy was the camouflage. Rose had a talent for it, switching from cruelty to charm in an instant, her face a mask no one could read. But evil, no matter how well buried, always leaves traces. In 1994, police investigating the disappearance of one of their former lodgers began searching the property. What they found beneath the floorboards stopped Britain in its tracks. One body led to another, then another, then another. 9 in total, later joined by 2 more from elsewhere. The scale of the horror stunned even seasoned detectives. Among the dead was Rose's own stepdaughter, Charmaine, just 8 years old. Evidence showed that Rose had beaten and killed her while Fred was serving time in prison, then lied about the child's whereabouts for years. When investigators confronted Rose with this, she didn't flinch. She denied everything with a calmness that chilled even the most experienced officers. Fred West took the easy way out. He confessed, then hanged himself in his cell before trial. That left Rose to face the weight of it all alone. 10 murders that spanned 2 decades. 10 young women and girls whose lives ended inside a house that looked perfectly ordinary from the street. During her trial in 1995, jurors heard testimony that felt like descending into a nightmare. Survivors described how Rose's demeanor could shift from warm to sadistic in seconds. Forensic experts detailed the hidden chambers, the concealed rooms, the shallow graves that Fred had built under her instruction. One by one, the names of the dead were read aloud, and for each name, Rose sat motionless, a mask of indifference. When the verdict came, there was no relief, only silence. Rose West was found guilty of 10 murders and given a whole life order. No parole, no possibility of release. The judge called her a truly depraved woman, someone who had enjoyed the pain of others. Today, she lives behind the gray walls of a high-security prison, her name still enough to darken any room it's spoken in. Other inmates avoid her. Some are fascinated by her, others disgusted. Rose rarely speaks of the past. She spends her days quietly, sewing, reading, sometimes writing letters that never get replies. But every guard who walks past her cell knows what those hands once did, what those walls once hid. The house at 25 Cromwell Street was torn down years ago, reduced to rubble and paved over so no one would ever live there again. But the ground remembers. Locals still say that when the wind hits just right, it feels colder on that corner, as if the air itself knows what happened there. Rose West turned the concept of home into something monstrous, a place where love was a disguise and kindness was bait. She didn't just live inside that house of horror. She built it room by room, secret by secret, until every brick carried the echo of her crimes. And though the house is gone, her shadow remains. Proof that the most terrifying monsters are the ones who smile from behind the window pane. 3. Myra Hindley, the woman who fell into the abyss. When people think of Myra Hindley, they remember the photograph first, the cold, pale stare framed by platinum hair. A face that became a symbol of something Britain had never seen before. A woman who chose to stand beside evil and call it love. But Myra didn't begin that way. She was an ordinary girl from Manchester, raised in gray streets and narrow rooms. She went to church, went dancing, kept a diary filled with hopes that sound heartbreakingly small now. Things like wanting to marry, wanting to be seen. Then she met Ian Brady, and the course of her life turned toward darkness so absolute it would swallow her whole. Brady wasn't just a man. To Myra, he was an idea. Dangerous, magnetic, and intoxicating. He spoke in riddles about power, control, and freedom from moral limits. He lent her books by Nietzsche, shared photographs of war crimes, and told her the world was full of weak people who deserved to be used. Myra, eager to impress him, started repeating his words. Bit by bit, she began to shed the things that made her human. It began subtly. He asked her to test boundaries, lies told to family, cruel jokes at others' expense. When she obeyed, he smiled. Each small act became proof of loyalty. Until, eventually, he asked her to help him hunt. Between 1963 and 1965, the pair would lure children and teenagers into their car with offers of help or adventure, then drive them to the desolate sweep of Saddleworth Moor. It was Myra's voice that often coaxed the victims inside, her face that inspired trust. Once the doors locked, that trust evaporated. The crimes themselves defied comprehension, not only because of what was done, but because of who did it. The image of a woman participating in such acts shook Britain to its core. For decades afterward, people struggled with one question: what could transform a young woman into someone capable of that level of cruelty? At the center of it was control. Brady saw himself as a teacher, and Myra as his pupil. He dictated everything: what she read, how she dressed, what she said. Even her hair became part of the performance. He wanted her blonde, striking, untouchable. Together, they documented their crimes in photographs and audio recordings, souvenirs of domination. Each image was another brick in the monument they built to themselves. A monument of horror disguised as love. The middle of their story, the point where fascination turned to infamy, came with one single tape. It was found during the investigation, an audio recording that prosecutors would later play in court. On it, a child's voice pleaded for mercy, while Myra's could be heard in the background, calm, detached, even instructive. That sound broke the nation. It shattered the illusion that she was merely a follower, an unwilling accomplice. It proved she had crossed a line from obedience into ownership of the cruelty. When police finally closed in, it wasn't bravery or confession that brought the truth. It was a mistake, a relative discovering evidence, a photograph left where it shouldn't have been. Arrest followed. Myra and Ian were charged with the murders of 5 children: Pauline Reed, John Kilbride, Keith Bennett, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. Each life ended in terror on those bleak moors. The trial in 1966 drew the kind of attention reserved for wars and royal events. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, shouting her name like a curse. Newspapers printed her photograph daily, dissecting every glance, every gesture. Inside, Myra sat beside Brady, silent, unmoved. She listened as prosecutors described the unimaginable in cold detail, as mothers wept on the stand, as evidence of her participation mounted. The verdict was inevitable. Both were found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Brady would die in a psychiatric hospital decades later. Myra would spend the rest of her life behind bars, pleading for redemption the public never believed she deserved. In prison, she tried to rebuild herself. She learned theology, wrote letters claiming remorse, fought for parole that never came. To the world outside, she remained the embodiment of moral collapse. The woman who had traded empathy for obsession. Every time her name resurfaced in the news, outrage followed. For the families of the victims, her survival felt like an open wound that refused to heal. When Myra Hindley died in 2002, she had spent 36 years in captivity. There were no tears, no vigils, no flowers outside the prison gates. Just a kind of collective exhale, the closing of a chapter that had haunted Britain for nearly half a century. But her story still lingers in the national consciousness. Not because people want to remember her, but because she forces them to confront something terrifying. That evil doesn't always come roaring into the world. Sometimes it walks hand in hand with love. Sometimes it starts with the simple desire to be chosen. and ends on the moor under a gray sky, where the echoes of lost children never quite fade. 4. Joanna Dennehy. Most killers hide what they've done. Joanna Dennehy didn't. She smiled. She laughed. She posed for selfies with the knife still dripping and told her accomplices she'd never felt more alive. Hers wasn't a story of desperation or revenge. It was entertainment. She killed for pleasure. In 2013, Cambridgeshire police began finding bodies dumped in ditches. 3 men, all stabbed repeatedly with the same blade. Their wounds were so precise that detectives thought they were looking for a professional hitman. What they didn't know yet was that the killer wasn't hiding in shadows or wearing gloves. She was out walking the streets in eyeliner and leather boots, hunting her next target like it was a game. Joanna Dennehy had been trouble long before the killings. Born in Hertfordshire, she was bright, funny, magnetic, and volatile. She drifted through life like a live wire, collecting chaos wherever she went. By her mid-20s, she'd cut ties with her family, sunk into addiction, and developed a fascination with domination. Violence for her wasn't a means to an end. It was the end. Her spree began quietly. A sudden decision. No plan, no reason. Her first victim, Łukasz Slaboszewski, thought he was meeting a friend. He walked into her flat, expecting flirtation, maybe danger in the harmless sense. Instead, Joanna picked up a knife and drove it straight into his heart. She watched him die, calm as still water. And when he stopped moving, she dragged his body into a trash bin and poured herself a drink. 2 days later, she did it again. This time to John Chapman, a housemate who'd done nothing worse than fall asleep on the sofa. He never even opened his eyes. She attacked him mid-sleep, stabbing him so many times the blade bent. And when she realized she wasn't done, she turned to Kevin Lee, her landlord, her lover, the man who thought he could fix her. Kevin's death became the most theatrical of all. Joanna dressed him in a black sequined dress before dumping his body in a roadside ditch. When police found him, his clothes were torn, his chest and neck slashed open in a frenzy that looked almost ritualistic. But for Joanna, it wasn't about ceremony. It was about spectacle. In the middle of the spree, she texted her accomplice, Gary Stretch, a man twice her size and completely under her control. "I've got the taste for it," she wrote. "I want my fun." There was no remorse, no hesitation, only appetite. She and Stretch drove hundreds of miles, laughing, listening to music, looking for new victims. Somewhere between Hereford and Peterborough, she tried to stab 2 random men just to see if she still could. Both survived by pure luck. When police finally caught up with her, Joanna didn't run. She didn't deny it. She didn't even seem surprised. In custody, she told officers, "I killed to see how it would feel, and it felt good." Then she smiled for the camera, head tilted, like she was posing for a magazine cover. The trial that followed felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a performance. Joanna refused to enter a plea of insanity. She told her lawyer she didn't want to waste anyone's time pretending to be mad. "I'm not mad," she said. "I'm a murderer." She spoke about her crimes the way other people talk about hobbies, casually, almost cheerfully. Psychiatrists called her a textbook psychopath, impulsive, fearless, manipulative, and utterly without empathy. What shocked everyone wasn't just what she did, but how easily she owned it. She mocked the judge. She winked at reporters. She told one psychologist she enjoyed being different, that killing made her feel special. It was pure ego, wrapped in the body of a woman who looked too small to hold so much rage. When the sentence came, a whole life order, meaning she would die in prison, she didn't flinch. No tears, no last-minute pleas, just that same smile. As the guard led her away, she looked back at the courtroom and said, "It could have been more." Inside the walls of HMP Bronzefield, Joanna became a legend almost instantly. Other inmates whispered about her, the woman who killed for the thrill, who carved a path through the country and laughed while doing it. She strutted through the corridors like the violence had made her immortal. But time does strange things to thrill seekers. In confinement, with no chase left, no audience to perform for, the silence grows louder, the adrenaline fades, the fame curdles. Joanna Dennehy, the woman who once killed for fun, now spends her days under constant watch, her name still synonymous with unrestrained violence. Her crimes didn't just horrify Britain, they disturbed something deeper. They showed that not every murderer is born from trauma or desperation. Some just want to feel the spark of power, the pulse of chaos. And for a few terrible days in 2013, Joanna Dennehy lived entirely inside that spark, a storm in human form, laughing as she burned everything in her path. 5. Sharon Carr. There are killers who terrify because of what they've done, and then there are those who terrify because of when they did it. In 1992, Britain discovered that evil can wear a school uniform. Sharon Carr was 12 years old, too young to drive, too young to vote, too young to understand the finality of death. But that didn't stop her from taking a life in a way so violent, so senseless, that police struggled to believe a child could have done it. It happened in the quiet town of Camberley, Surrey. On the night of June 7th, 18-year-old hairdresser Katie Ratcliffe left a nightclub and started walking home. The streets were calm, the kind of suburban silence where nothing bad ever seems to happen. Somewhere along that dark stretch of road, a figure stepped from the shadows. A child no one would have feared. What followed was pure frenzy. Katie was stabbed more than 30 times, each wound driven with ferocious strength. The attack was so savage that detectives assumed the killer had to be a grown man, someone consumed by rage or jealousy. Her body was left in the grass near the roadside, and for years, police chased phantom suspects, ex-boyfriends, strangers, anyone but a 12-year-old girl from down the street. Sharon Carr went back to school the next morning like nothing had happened. She giggled with friends, played with her hair, copied homework. No one looked twice. How could they? She was a child. But inside her notebooks, something was growing, something that would eventually expose her for what she was. Over the next 2 years, Sharon's behavior spiraled into violence. She attacked classmates, stabbed another student with scissors, and bragged to anyone who'd listen that she liked blood. Teachers called her troubled. Psychiatrists called her disturbed. But nobody connected her to Katie Ratcliffe's unsolved murder. Not yet. It wasn't until 1994, when Sharon attacked another girl with a knife and was sent to a young offenders institution, that the truth began to surface. In custody, she started writing diary entries that read like horror fiction, except every line was real. She described the thrill of stabbing Katie, the way the knife felt warm, the excitement that rushed through her veins. She named her victim. She relived the murder again and again on paper, not out of guilt, but out of pleasure. Investigators couldn't believe what they were reading. They compared the details in her writings with evidence from the unsolved case. The number of wounds, the location, even the position of the body. It matched perfectly. The words of a child had just solved a murder that had haunted detectives for years. When officers confronted Sharon, she didn't deny it. She smiled. She told them she enjoyed killing Katie because it made her feel like God. That's when the press gave her a name that stuck: the Devil's Daughter. Court psychiatrists struggled to explain her. She wasn't driven by revenge or desperation. She wasn't abused, neglected, or coerced. There was no clear reason, just a fascination with death and a desire to see someone die by her hand. She spoke about the murder with the same tone most children use when talking about games. It was chilling, not just because of what she said, but how easily she said it. Because of her age, Sharon couldn't stand trial for murder in the normal way. She was detained indefinitely under the Mental Health Act. The youngest person in British history to be convicted of such a crime. She was sent to a secure psychiatric unit, where doctors hoped time and treatment would soften whatever darkness had taken root inside her. But time didn't fix her. It hardened her. Even in confinement, Sharon attacked staff, threatened inmates, and wrote more about killing. Her diary became darker, her fantasies more elaborate. One entry read, "I'm going to be famous. People will remember my name." Today, decades later, she's still locked away. A woman in her 40s with the same cold fascination that began when she was a child. Psychiatrists call her dangerous, unpredictable, a permanent threat to anyone around her. She's one of the few prisoners in Britain whose detention has no end date. The most disturbing part of Sharon Carr's story isn't just what she did to Katie Ratcliffe. It's that she did it before she even understood what life meant. Before she could comprehend what it means to end one. There was no motive, no trauma, no lesson to learn. Just a 12-year-old girl who wanted to see what it felt like to take a life. In the years since, psychologists and criminologists have studied her case endlessly, searching for an explanation that never quite fits. Some call her a psychopath born too soon. Others say she's proof that darkness doesn't wait for adulthood. But maybe the truth is simpler and far more terrifying. Sharon Carr wasn't shaped by the world. She brought something into it, something no one saw coming until it was too late. And though she's been locked away for more than 30 years, her story remains a warning that evil doesn't always arrive with age. Sometimes it begins in childhood, small, smiling, and already beyond saving. 6. Lorraine Thorpe. When police arrested 15-year-old Lorraine Thorpe in 2009, they didn't believe she could be capable of what they were hearing. She was small, shy-faced, her voice barely above a whisper. But the crime she'd helped commit wasn't small at all. 2 people were dead, one of them her own father. And the brutality of what had been done would leave detectives stunned. Lorraine's story began far from the courtroom. She grew up in the shadows of Ipswich's streets, a child raised among addicts, alcoholics, and transient strangers who taught her that violence was how you survived. Her home wasn't a home at all, just a revolving door of chaos and neglect. By 12, she was drinking. By 13, she was sleeping rough. And by 14, she had fallen under the control of a man who would destroy what little innocence she had left. That man was Paul Clark. Twice her age, controlling, volatile, and feared among the city's homeless community. Clark saw in Lorraine not a child to protect, but a weapon to shape. He fed her, praised her, and turned her into his shadow. She followed him everywhere. Into bars, alleys, fights. Together, they became a pair that others avoided, bound by dependence and violence. The first victim was Rosalind Hunt, a vulnerable woman who lived among the same street crowd. One night in August 2009, Clark decided Rosalind had crossed him, accused her of gossiping. In that world, grudges turned deadly fast. He and Lorraine dragged Rosalind into a flat, beat her with fists, bottles, and boots until she couldn't move. But the most shocking detail wasn't Clark's rage, it was Lorraine's participation. She joined in, striking, shouting, echoing his fury, like a child trying to please a cruel parent. When police found Rosalind's body, the injuries were catastrophic. Broken ribs, torn skin, trauma from head to toe. Detectives soon realized this wasn't a one-sided attack. The small footprints in the blood told their own story. But Lorraine's descent didn't end there. Days later, she turned on her own father. Barry Thorpe was a broken man, an alcoholic who had long since lost control of his life or his daughter. He was no threat, no enemy. But in Lorraine's new world, weakness was a sin. After killing Rosalind, she feared her father might talk to the police, that he might tell them what she and Clark had done, so she silenced him too. The scene inside Barry's flat was pure chaos. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and a body beaten beyond recognition. Lorraine had joined in again, helping Clark finish what they started. When officers finally arrested her, she didn't cry or protest. She just stared straight ahead, blank, as if she'd already checked out of her own life. During questioning, she spoke in short, simple sentences. She said she didn't remember everything, that Clark had told her to do it, that she didn't think anyone would die. But investigators could see through the fog. The pattern of violence, the eagerness to please, the lack of fear. It wasn't just obedience, it was transformation. In court, prosecutors described her as a child who became a killer before she ever became an adult. They told the jury about her life in the streets, her relationship with Clark, and how she'd taken part in 2 murders within a single week. The defense tried to argue she'd been brainwashed, that years of neglect and manipulation had turned her into a follower, but the jury couldn't look past the sheer savagery of the crimes. Lorraine Thorpe was convicted of both murders. Because of her age, she couldn't be sentenced to life without parole. But the judge made it clear she would spend many years behind bars. "You chose cruelty," he said, "when you could have chosen to walk away." At 15, she became the youngest female double murderer in modern British history. Prison turned her from a child into something harder. Officers described her as volatile, unpredictable, sometimes violent, sometimes withdrawn. She drifted between silence and outbursts, haunted by the world she came from and the one she created. Psychologists tried to reach her, to understand whether she felt remorse. Some said she was traumatized, others said she was lost beyond saving. Today, Lorraine remains behind bars. No longer is the frightened teenager who followed a violent man through the streets, but a grown woman whose name now permanently tied to brutality. She has never spoken publicly about what happened. No interviews, no apologies, just silence. The story of Lorraine Thorpe isn't about a monster born. It's about a child built from the wreckage of neglect and rage. A child who never learned love, only loyalty to the wrong people. By the time she understood what she'd done, it was too late to undo it. 2 lives ended because she wanted someone to need her. 2 murders, committed by a girl who never stood a chance at being ordinary. And somewhere inside those prison walls, the teenager who once laughed at violence now lives surrounded by it. The product of a world that taught her only one lesson: mercy is a weakness, and once it's gone, there's no way back. 7. Maria Pearson. Some killers strike out of greed, others out of fear. Maria Pearson killed because she couldn't let go. Hers wasn't the kind of anger that flares and fades. It was the kind that festers quietly until it bursts, taking everything with it. In 1986, Hartlepool was a small coastal town where everyone knew each other's business. Maria was 23, newly separated, and still tangled in the aftermath of a failed marriage to a man named Malcolm Pearson. The split had been bitter, messy, and loud. The kind of breakup that doesn't end when the papers are signed. But what Maria couldn't stand wasn't losing Malcolm. It was watching him move on. He had met someone new, 22-year-old Janet Newton. Warm, unassuming, the sort of woman who didn't invite trouble. The two began seeing each other quietly, hoping time would dull Maria's obsession. It didn't. Friends later recalled that Maria talked about Janet constantly. She followed them, called their house, waited outside bars. The jealousy wasn't hidden. It was an open wound that everyone could see, but no one could stop. On the morning of August 20th, 1986, Maria saw them together again. Something inside her snapped. She went home, grabbed a knife, and set out to find Janet Newton. What happened next would turn a love triangle into one of Britain's most shocking domestic murders. Maria found Janet walking down Grange Road, just a few minutes from her home. Witnesses later said Maria was shouting before she even reached her. The argument was short, vicious, and loud enough for nearby shopkeepers to come to their doors. Then, in a burst of motion too fast for anyone to stop, Maria stabbed Janet 17 times. In the chest, neck, and back. A storm of blows that came from pure rage, not reason. Janet collapsed on the pavement while Maria stood over her, knife in hand, her anger finally spent. By the time police arrived, Janet was gone. Maria didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood there, shaking, blood on her hands, whispering the same name again and again. Malcolm. The trial that followed painted Maria as a woman consumed by jealousy, unable to accept rejection. Prosecutors described her as possessive, impulsive, and utterly without restraint. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity, saying she'd lost control in the heat of emotion. But the 17 stab wounds told a different story. Not a flash of madness, but an eruption of bottled fury. When the verdict came, Maria Pearson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 12 years. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. But Maria's name would come to stand for something more. The endurance of punishment. Because Maria didn't change. Decades passed, prisons changed, the world moved on. But inside, she stayed volatile. She fought with other inmates, she attacked officers. She defied every rule. Each time the parole board reviewed her case, her behavior made release impossible. What began as a minimum sentence stretched into decades, until she became known as Britain's longest-serving female prisoner. From her cell, Maria wrote letters blaming everyone but herself. She claimed she'd been provoked, that she never meant to kill, that the system was keeping her locked away unfairly. But psychologists who interviewed her said she showed no genuine remorse, only frustration at being caught. Other women came and went serving their time, rebuilding their lives outside. Maria remained. Years became decades. By her 40s, she was infamous. By her 50s, she was institutionalized. A name on prison rolls, older than some of the officers guarding her. Now in her 60s, Maria Pearson still sits behind bars. She spent more than 3 times her original tariff and continues to be denied parole, not for what she did nearly 40 years ago, but for who she's remained ever since. Angry, unrepentant, unpredictable. The system doesn't trust her, and she's given them no reason to. Her story isn't one of mystery or madness. It's one of emotion, left unchecked. Jealousy hardened into obsession, then calcified into something even colder. When Maria plunged that knife into Janet Newton's body, she didn't just kill her rival. She sentenced herself to a lifetime of walls and silence. The irony is brutal. She wanted to punish another woman for taking the life she thought was hers. Instead, she ended up erasing her own. Maria Pearson has now spent nearly 4 decades in custody, longer than she ever lived free. She's watched new inmates arrive young and leave middle-aged. She's watched prison staff retire while she remains. Somewhere, deep down, she must know that time itself became her real sentence. Not the judge's words, but the endless years that followed them. And as of now, there's no sign she'll ever walk out. The girl who once killed out of jealousy has become a ghost of her own making, a reminder that some emotions, once unleashed, never fade. They just keep pacing the same cell, year after year, waiting for a door that will never open. 8. Linda Calvey. In London's East End during the 1980s, crime had a certain swagger. It wore designer suits, drove fast cars, and talked in whispers over champagne. And moving through that world, as confident as any man in it, was a woman with green eyes and a dangerous smile. Linda Calvey. To some, she was a loyal wife and mother. To others, she was the most ruthless armed robber they'd ever met. But behind the charm and glamour was a woman who would one day earn a darker name: the Black Widow. Linda's story begins like a love song gone wrong. She wasn't born into crime. She walked into it for love. In her 20s, she fell for a man named Mickey Calvey, a notorious armed robber with a reputation for daring heists and easy charm. Mickey didn't hide what he was, and Linda didn't care. She liked the excitement, the danger, the life that came with it. Soon she was driving getaway cars, planning routes, and counting stolen cash as if it were perfectly ordinary. For a while it worked. They were a team, in crime and in love. But the streets have a way of chewing up everyone who plays too long. In 1979, Mickey Calvey was shot dead by police during a failed robbery, and Linda's world cracked open. She swore she'd never love another criminal, never risk that kind of loss again. But promises mean little to people addicted to danger. In the years that followed, Linda kept circling the same orbit. Men with guns, men with power, men who lived one job away from disaster. She remarried, divorced, remarried again. Each time the pattern repeated: love, crime, betrayal. But in 1990, she met someone who would drag her back into the kind of darkness she couldn't charm her way out of: Ronnie Cook. Ronnie was her lover, her partner, and her undoing. Their relationship was volatile from the start. Arguments turned physical, affection turned to resentment. Linda confided to friends that she was frightened of him, that she wanted out. And then, one night she decided the only way to be free was to make sure Ronnie Cook stopped breathing. She didn't pull the trigger herself. At least that's what she's always claimed. What's certain is this: Ronnie Cook was found dead, shot in the back of the head at close range. The gunman was a hired hitman, someone Linda knew, someone who didn't live long enough to tell his side. Police traced the plan back to her through phone calls, money transfers, and a pattern of conversations that made her motive unmistakable. During her trial, prosecutors called her the mastermind. They said she'd orchestrated the murder, paid for the weapon, and arranged the alibi. The tabloids called her something else: the Black Widow, a woman whose lovers seemed to end up dead or destroyed. She smiled in court, perfectly made up, defiant even in handcuffs. When the verdict came down, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. She was 42. For someone who'd built her identity on glamour and freedom, prison was the ultimate fall. But Linda Calvey wasn't finished rewriting her story. Behind bars, she became a legend. Other inmates gravitated toward her. The woman who'd lived the kind of life most of them only read about. She was charismatic, articulate, impossible to ignore. For years, she maintained her innocence, claiming she'd been framed by her accomplices, that the real killer had turned on her. She wrote books, gave interviews, and told her version again and again. She hadn't killed Ronnie. She'd simply loved the wrong man in the wrong world. 18 years later, after endless appeals and petitions, Linda Calvey walked out of prison on license. She was in her 60s, still sharp, still glamorous, still calling herself misunderstood. To this day, she insists she didn't order the killing, that she was a pawn in someone else's plan. But the courts never believed her, and neither did the families left behind. What makes her story endure isn't just the crime, it's the contradictions. The woman who could charm anyone and yet destroy everything she touched, the mother and the murderer, the lover and the liar, the criminal who still sees herself as a victim of love. Now living quietly under a new identity, Linda Calvey remains a figure caught between myth and reality. Part underworld folklore, part cautionary tale. Her life reads like a film script. Robberies, betrayals, prison cells, lovers who never lived to tell her secrets. And maybe that's what she always wanted. To be remembered. Because whether you believe her or not, one thing is certain. Every man who ever loved Linda Calvey paid a price for it. The Black Widow didn't strike with poison or seduction. She struck with charm, with trust, with timing. And in the end, she proved that sometimes the most dangerous kind of killer isn't the one who hides in the dark. It's the one who smiles while she pulls you in. 9. Jemma Mitchell.
Alright, Jemma, at this moment, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder.
On a summer afternoon in 2021, a woman wheeled a large blue suitcase out of a quiet West London house. The CCTV camera caught everything. The calm expression, the steady pace, the ordinary motion of someone taking out luggage. But what that suitcase held would unravel one of the most disturbing murder cases modern Britain has ever seen. The woman was Jemma Mitchell, a trained osteopath with a degree in human sciences and a mind that on paper looked brilliant. She spoke softly, quoted scripture, and carried herself with the serenity of someone who believed in healing. To her friends and clients, she was a gentle soul, spiritual, kind, and endlessly patient. But beneath that calm exterior lived a delusion as sharp as the blade she would later use. Her victim, Mi-Quen Deborah Chong, was a 67-year-old devout Christian and a woman known for her generosity. She'd once befriended Jemma through church, offering help when Jemma's life began to fall apart. Financial trouble, family disputes, dreams of building a wellness center that never came to life. Deborah lent her thousands of pounds and listened when Jemma spoke of visions and divine guidance. But when Deborah started asking for the money back and questioning Jemma's increasingly erratic behavior, something inside Jemma fractured. By June 2021, the two women's friendship had turned into quiet tension. Jemma was broke, desperate, and humiliated. And then one day she simply decided that Deborah Chong had to die. There were no witnesses to what happened inside Deborah's home on June 11th. But the evidence left behind told a story of planning and precision. Jemma arrived carrying a large suitcase, stayed for several hours, and left alone. Inside that case, police later determined, was Deborah's body, killed by a brutal blow to the head. Jemma had decapitated her afterward, carefully wrapping the remains before wheeling them away through London streets in broad daylight. The calmness of her movements is what chilled investigators most. No panic, no rush, no hesitation. Just method. For more than 2 weeks, Deborah's disappearance puzzled friends and family. Jemma even sent messages pretending to be concerned, suggesting Deborah had gone on a spiritual retreat. Meanwhile, she stored the body in her own home, waiting for the right moment to dispose of it. That moment came on June 26th, when she drove 200 miles to Devon. The suitcase was in her car, sealed and heavy. Somewhere along a country lane near Salcombe, she dumped it down a wooded embankment and drove away, leaving nature to finish the cover-up. But the plan didn't work. A few days later, a hiker discovered the decomposed remains, and the story that would soon captivate the nation began to unfold. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives traced Jemma's car through ANPR cameras, matched DNA, and pulled the crucial CCTV footage from London, showing her with that same suitcase. The timeline was airtight. When police searched her home, they found the victim's blood, her papers, and fragments of bone. They also found something else: a notebook filled with religious writings and references to destiny, judgment, and cleansing. To investigators, it read less like scripture and more like justification. During the trial, prosecutors described Jemma as a woman obsessed with image and control, someone who used religion as armor and intellect as a weapon. She'd constructed a persona of purity, quoting faith while committing acts that mocked everything she claimed to believe in. When asked why she killed Deborah Chong, they said it was simple: greed and pride. She wanted the money, she wanted the validation, and she couldn't bear the thought of being seen as a failure. Jemma sat through the trial motionless. No outbursts, no tears, no remorse. Only calculation. As if she were watching someone else's life unravel, not her own. The jury saw through the act. They convicted her of murder, making her the first woman in the UK to have her sentencing televised. When the judge handed down a whole life order, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of the gavel. It was justice with a modern echo, the cold, digital certainty of a killer caught on camera. Today, Jemma Mitchell lives out her days behind the walls of a high-security prison. Her name has joined a list she once would have dismissed as beneath her. Killers defined not by circumstance, but by choice. What makes her story linger isn't just the violence, it's the calmness. The way she moved through London streets with death zipped neatly behind her. The way she smiled in photos, eyes bright with the certainty that she'd outsmarted everyone. The way she spoke about faith while committing a crime born from vanity. Her brilliance, her poise, her education. None of it mattered in the end. All it did was make the lie more convincing, the betrayal more complete. And somewhere in Devon, beneath the trees and the soil, the last remnants of that lie were found. The proof that evil doesn't always rage. Sometimes it studies anatomy, prays to God, and carries its sins in a suitcase. We've just walked through the darkest corners of the human mind. Women who destroyed lives not in moments of chaos, but through choices so deliberate they still echo decades later. Hospitals, homes, moors, and city streets. Each crime scene told us something different about power, control, and the face of evil. But after hearing all of them, one question remains. What do you think creates someone like this? Is it something they're born with, or something the world teaches them to become? I want to know your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. And tell me too, what time is it right now where you're watching this? Which country are you joining from? Because these stories travel far beyond the walls of any prison. They remind us that evil doesn't belong to one place, one age, or one face. It hides behind ordinary smiles. And sometimes you only see it when it's far too late. If you made it to this point, you're one of the few who stayed through every moment. From the nurse who turned mercy into murder to the woman whose crimes are almost unbelievable. So before you go, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Not just for more true crime stories, but for the conversations that follow them. Every week, we open another case. Another story that asks the same question. What drives someone to cross the line between human and monster? So hit that bell, stay curious, and keep your lights low. Because the next story might be even darker than this one.